Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new meeting of the Finance Network series titled In Conversation, exploring the philosophy of money and finance. And today we are delighted to welcome Adrian Walsh for University of New England, who will be interviewed by Declan Humphreys from the Sunshine Coast University. And thanks again, Adrian and Declan, for accepting our invitation. And today's interview is very exciting and is titled Is the Pursuit of Money Incompatible with Morality? Some Historical and Philosophical Reflection. And the interview is inspired by a chapter authored by Adrian Walsh in the recently published volume The Philosophy of Money and Finance, and edited by Jürgen Sandberg and Lisa Bareski, who I thank again. And it was published for Oxford University Press. And as usual, following the interview, we will open the floor for discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand using the Zoom menu, and I will moderate the queue. And that's all for me from now. And let's begin the interview. Enjoy it.
Thanks, Emiliano. So yeah, I'd like to thank Emiliano and Lisa for inviting myself and Adrian today. My name's Declan Humphreys, and our interview will be with Adrian Walsh, who's Professor of Philosophy and Political Theory at the University of New England in Australia. So he works predominantly in political philosophy, the philosophy of economics, and applied ethics. Adrian's held research fellowships at the University of St Andrews in Scotland and the University of Helsinki. He's currently a guest professor in the Financial Ethics Research Center at the University of Gothenburg. He's written a number of books, including the groundbreaking The Morality of Money from 2008, and also a forthcoming book entitled Between Ethics and Economics, A Moral Leeway Approach to Business Ethics with Joachim Sandberg. And as Emiliano said, today we're going to be talking about a book chapter entitled Is the Pursuit of Money Incompatible with Morality? So Adrian, well, I would like to start maybe just with a bit of your background. And how did you start thinking about money as a philosophical topic?
Thanks, Declan. Thanks for the introduction. My background, my original interest in philosophy was in theories of social justice. So when I was in the 1980s, there was a lot of work on John Rawls, there still is, and there's an enormous amount of work on theories of distributive justice mainly. But what that led to for me were topics in the philosophy of economics. And I think partly if you're interested in distributive justice, it's not surprising you might become interested in philosophy of economics, in economic systems, because allocations, are largely determined by the market. So I suppose that, well, often a great many distributions determined by the market. So, and there's questions about the extent to which they're governed by principles of justice, I suppose. Anyway, I was thinking, as far as thinking about money specifically as a topic, I read a book by Michael Walzer called Spheres of Justice. It was written in 1983. And it's a wonderful book, and it thinks about the way that in our culture, in our literature, in our songs, in our everyday discussions, principles of justice are implicit. They're not always explicit, but there are all sorts of different ways that we talk about and argue about how different goods should be allocated. And I think part of what interested me was the way that he really grounded philosophical questions about justice in everyday cultural artifacts, I suppose. Anyway, in that book, he had a chapter called Money and Commodities, and he does a lot of it's talking about what sorts of things shouldn't be commodities, shouldn't be commodified. And he provides a list of 13 such items. And I think, and he tells stories about the way that money fits into our world, into our culture, and as I was saying, our values. And got really me thinking about the meaning we attach to money, all right, and the role of money in our ordinary interactions that we have, and norms and etiquettes that we have around money. So just to take an example, example I've used before is, you have young children, Declan. I help you out, and I come over, and or a friend, doesn't have to be me, a friend babysits one of your young children, and at the end of it, just say, for instance, you decide then to pay me, or pay your friend. Right. And in a way, that sort of seems inappropriate in relationship to the friendship that we have, or it could be, a relation as well. But then if you actually gave me, a bottle of red wine or some beers, I think that, and they might well be the exact cost as much as what, the money you would have given. I wouldn't find that offensive. And I think I just tell that story because I think part what got me interested was a lot of the moral psychology around money and the way that we use money and the way that just in ordinary interactions, we have, more sophisticated norms about money than we probably are aware of. The other thing that got me thinking about this was that philosophers or contemporary philosophers haven't really said much about money and the moral psychology of money, I suppose. I mean, you find it in anthropology, you find it in sociology, and you find it in literature and literary studies, but not really philosophy. And I think it contrasts in that sense with, say, think of two other areas where we have strong views and have strong impact, big impact in our lives: sex and war. I mean, both of those, obviously have an enormous impact on our lives in different kinds of ways. In both of those cases, I mean, there are areas where there's an enormous amount of philosophical literature written on both, the philosophy of war, I'm thinking about, and moreover on, philosophy and sex. And I think in those cases, there's substantive philosophical discussions, but it's not true and hasn't been true of money as a moral phenomenon, I suppose. And I think that was partly what came to interest me. And I wanted to try to make a more systematic, a philosophical approach to what the way we think about money. Actually, the other thing that came up in relationship to this, at one stage early on, I read a book by R.H. Tawney, called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And it was kind of, the Tawney book looked at all these philosophers in the past, particularly in the medieval period, who he called them economic casualists. And so the Tawney book, he talked about the way in which all of these various historical figures, and particularly medieval philosophers, but also Aristotle and Plato, had very clear views about the rights and wrongs of how we use money. And so it kind of got me thinking about why don't contemporary philosophers talk about this? But really, it was Walsh that got me thinking about this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm interested then on this chapter because you mentioned there, yes, obviously there's a lot of history, I think, of kind of looking at money, but the different contexts which you look at it, and the context of this paper is kind of looking at profit, isn't it? So looking at the profit, what do you call it? Profit motive. So can profit be compatible with morality? You in the paper itself or in the chapter itself, you have something called the incompatibility thesis when it comes to this kind of profit motive. Can you just explain what that term means?
No, good. Look, the idea is of the incompatibility thesis is simply that money, so the pursuit of profit is rather than money. The focus here is on the profit motive. The pursuit of profit and morality are incompatible. They're mutually exclusive. So I think that was the central idea I wanted to look at in this. And I looked at various historical cases where this has been claimed. You can find it right through. In literature and philosophy. In song. One case, you think William Blake, for instance, says, art and he's talking about art in this case, but art and money can't be in the same area. And similarly, people say moral values and the pursuit of money are incompatible. But I think what I wanted to do is put some place a critical lens, I suppose, on that, because I think there's some truth in it that there's a tension between the profit motive and morality. But I don't think, they're necessarily incompatible. So I think, in a way, what I have here is a modal claim about, the extent to which it's actually necessarily the case that if you're pursuing money or you've got a profit motive, that therefore what you're doing is necessarily immoral. It's a very common view, but then given most, the extent to which, a large proportion of human beings are engaged in a profit motive, pursuing it. So if that was taken seriously, and that they were necessarily incompatible, would mean that large proportion of humanity is acting immorally. So what I wanted to do was try to, in the first instance, show that there's not, they're not necessarily incompatible, but nonetheless there's a tension such that there are ways in which you can pursue profit that clearly are immoral. So I wanted to give a little bit more of a nuanced view about it. Yeah, it's not necessarily the case that money and morality are incompatible, or sorry, I should be clear here. The pursuit of the profit motive and morality, it's not necessarily the case that they're incompatible. But at the same time, unless I think there are concerns about it, and legitimate concerns about certain kinds of profit-seeking activity, which, in my terms, I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit later, probably, are where there's no moral side constraints, all right, on the action. So I do think that it's not that then, as I say, the point of the chapter in a way is say, well, hang on, are they necessarily incompatible? Well, no, but nonetheless, there's good reason to be concerned about certain kinds of profit seeking.
Yeah, but there are some objections then you look at, I think, in the chapter. So objections to the pursuit of money. Someone saying you can't pursue money because there's some kind of immorality there, or the pursuit of money is kind of or this profit motive. There's some objections.
Yeah.
So what are some of the objections that you kind of point out there?
Well, I think I picked up on four, and just to remember, the greed, distortion, distraction, and sharp practice. So one of them is just, I mean, and the first one, I mean, the idea of greed. You find this particularly in Aristotle and Plato. Both of them make this point. So one of the objections people have to profit motive is that at least it encourages people to be greedy. I mean, Plato has in I think it's in the Laws. He makes a comment about how innkeepers who are far from in an isolated area can't help but be tempted to kind of charge outrageous prices. So I suppose it's a little bit like when you buy beer or food at an airport and there's no other where else you can go. So I think that was the point that Plato was making about innkeepers. I mean, he has quite a passionate attack on innkeepers. Certainly, Aristotle says that money is a practice. Seeking money and seeking profit is a practice without an end point. He says it doesn't have a telos. It's not like if you decide to build a boat, there's a moment when you've built the boat and you've finished the boat building. But he says that money seeking and seeking profit and having a profit motive is something without any end point. And so therefore there's a tendency to encourage you towards greed. The second one I had was the notion of distortion. So the idea is that human beings, when they interact with one another, should be animated by solidarity. They should have solidaristic intentions. And I think that, again, rather than personal gain. And so somehow I think the idea that, you and I engaging in, I mean, I'm not defending these particular accounts of the criticisms, but I mean, that you and I in engaging with one another, I mean, the interaction shouldn't be based on like financial gain on either part. And moreover, to do so would distort the nature of the relationship. So one is that distorts. Another one is that distracts. And I think it distracts us from what the value. So when I mentioned that quote from William Blake, there the idea is that there's more elevated goals that we should have, and somehow pursuit of money, pursuit of profit undermines those. And I think the last one is basically sharp practice, and that's the idea that it encourages us to engage in sharp practice, to engage in activities that are dubious. I mean, I think even in the case you think about Martin Luther, historical point where he was objecting to the selling of the spiritual indulgences. I mean, if people remember the story where the Roman Catholic Church at the time was selling time out of purgatory, and Luther objected to this. And in many ways, this was part of the start of the Reformation. But part of his objection was that those who were buying those indulgences were being deceived. Okay, it's a very metaphysical kind of deception, but you can think of, more mundane examples where the pursuit of profit can lead people to engage in business practices that are, on the verge of legality, or on the edge of legality anyway, or even veering into criminality. Okay. So those were the four. So basically, it was what I said was greed, distortion, distraction, and sharp practice, and those are the four that I picked up. And it wasn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but those are the four that I honed in on as having sort of common in the history of discussions of the profit motive, or commonly found.
And then, so I think part of the point of your chapter there is to kind of argue against that, or at least to kind of bring out some of the nuance. That it isn't just profit, that, profit doesn't automatically equal immorality, I think. So you say, I think in the paper you say that there's some assumptions that the profit motive and morality, like they're at odds. You can't have profit motive and morality at the same.
Yep.
So, and there are some interesting mistakes I think you put in there. Can you just outline some of the mistakes that you think some people make in this kind of argument that profit and morality?
I suppose their philosophical makes mistakes or conceptual mistakes, but obviously they have moral input. I mean, the first one is just to mistake selfishness and self-interest. And, this is something probably philosophers haven't said as much as they might, but the mere fact that people are self-interested and they have interests in furthering their own interest doesn't mean necessarily selfish. And I think there is a conflation of those two. I mean, Anthony Flew is one of the few people that's written about profit motive. There's an article that was in Philosophy many years ago, and he spends a lot of time looking about the conflation of those two, the way that we run together self-interest and selfishness. I mean, I had this, a couple rather complicated terms, I suppose, but there's an altruism-only view of moral action. What I mean by that is simply that if you're actually concerned for other people, right, what some philosophers call other regarding action, if you are concerned for other people, then in order to be genuinely altruistic and then to be genuinely morally virtuous, I suppose, the action has to be entirely selfless. There can't be any kind of self-interested component to it. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, in order that moral action must be entirely altruistic, and I think that's a mistake. And I think it's also, that's the second mistake I think that goes on here. And the third one is that the profit motive, when people are pursuing profit, that the only motives that they have are averistic, they're greedy or averistic. So, there's a kind of characterization that the person who's seeking profit motive is entirely selfish. Now, maybe this is probably, you're not going to see this in business ethics journals probably, but nonetheless, I think it is one feature you find in certain criticisms of the profit motive. And that if you've got a profit motive, then you couldn't possibly have any concern for anybody else. So I think those are the three kind of mistakes, at least I focus on in that chapter.
Yeah. No, they're really interesting. I had a point on that, but I might come back to it. So I think the main thrust then of this chapter is kind of building a taxonomy of profit motives to kind of draw out this nuance. Do you want to go through that, the taxonomy, maybe some of the taxonomy that you have, these varieties of profit motives, to bring out some of that?
No, good. Look, I think but that's probably one of the more interesting things, if I can say that, of that particular chapter, and comes from work that I've done earlier. But I think people talk about the profit motive, and in fact, I want to talk about a variety of different kinds of profit motives. So, and talk about profit motivational sets. I think one of the things to remember is that, for a start, motives in any action can be mixed. And sometimes that makes it sound like, they're in conflict, or they're conflicting. But, the reasons that we do things are more complicated than just being animated by a single motive or intention. So I think part of it here is to say, look, there's different kinds of intentions. Let's talk, rather than talk about the profit motive, which we have been doing so far, but let's talk about, different kinds of profit motivational sets. And part of it also is distinguish between what might be a goal and what would be a side constraint. So this is actually the language, I get this from Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. And in that book, he talks about, you could have what's important is to notice sometimes something will be a goal, but there'll also be a side constraint which says this, I'm pursuing this goal, but there's certain things that I won't do in pursuit of that goal. Like, and it's a really important way of constructing the sort of motivational sets that we have. And then I've applied this to the notion of the profit motive. And the thing to note here is you can have, for a start, you can have mixed motives where there are a couple of different goals that you have in an action. So I'll just go through the four that I laid out in that, and I think they capture something important about the way that different people seek to make a profit. So the first one is where morality and profit seeking are both conceived of as goals of action. And so it's fully compatibilist, if you like, to use a sort of bit of philosophical terminology. It's fully compatibilist profit motive where you've got some moral goal, maybe let's just say this environmental goal. That's what it is. You've got a goal of trying to bring about some environmental end that you think is valuable. And at the same time, you've got a goal of pursuing profit. And often, there might be cases where they come into conflict, but nonetheless, that's a form of profit seeking where you have two goals alongside one another. All right. And then, there will be points where you might need to, where they come into conflict. But I mean, I think that's a genuine psychological case. This is not me making up some, thought experiment. I mean, this is the sort of thing we find in the real world. The second category is where, profit seeking is the only goal that you have, but there's moral side constraints on what you will do. So perhaps maybe you're not going to sell something that's, I don't know, it's going to poison people, or you might think is dubious. I don't know, for whatever moral reasons you have, you might think certain kinds of, you can make a profit, say back in the days of newspapers, selling papers that were sensationalist, and appealed to a certain kind of, often weren't particularly truthful. And I think in those cases, you might think, you might have a moral side constraint that says, I'm not going to do that. All right. I mean, you can think of lots of examples. I don't know. Might be selling vapes or, things that you think are harmful to people. So in that case where there's a side constraint, I think I'm calling that a cumulative profit motive. Then there's a third one I've got there, which I call a stipendiary profit motive. And that's where actually profit motive isn't your main goal, but it's where you've got some other goal. Let's just say might be, just take the environmental case. It might be that what you want to do is bring about certain kinds of what you take to environmentally good outcomes, and reduce the amount of, CO2 emissions or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, in this case, profit motive and profit is a side constraint because you need to make enough money to be able to, for the activity to go on. So in that case, you can see profit seeking itself is a side constraint and the goals are fundamentally non-commercial. And the fourth category here is the term that I coined. It's the leucopathic one. Now, the word leucopathic here is meant to be like leuca, which is a word term for money, and pathic, obviously, some sort of pathology. So the idea is that a leucopathic is a person who will do anything for money, and there are no moral side constraints on their behaviour. All right, now, often when people have been critical of profit seeking, that it's the leucopathic they have in mind, I think. But as I'm trying to say here, there's lots of different ways in which people can seek profit they're not at odds with the pursuit of moral goals. And so that's the four that I laid out. There's probably other ways that you could come up with more combinations of morality, and I'm saying you could finesse that more, but that's the sort of basic line I have. And I think it reflects, I mean, I don't think it's just a sort of philosophical taxonomy. I think it captures the different ways that agents in the real world of business actually act.
Yeah, that's great. I really enjoyed reading through the taxonomy. Listen, that's all for the questions that I have. I might try to give back to Emiliano, and perhaps we can open it up for more questions. Thanks, Adrian.
Okay.
Thank you, Declan. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian and Declan, for this very exciting interview. And I guess there are questions coming from the audience, and so we can now open the Q&A. I don't know if there are people willing to make questions. Otherwise, I have a question to break the ice. And okay, and there is a question from Andrea Melody. So, okay.
Hi, thank you, Adrian, for the wonderful talk. I was wondering if the amount of profit is relevant or affects your views, because obviously we can have extreme amounts of profits gained by billionaires of our time, which is really relevant to the political debate today. So I was wondering if those kinds of extremely large amounts of profits would affect your view of the morality or immorality of that kind of profit motives?
Okay, that's a really good question. I hadn't thought that through. I mean, um, no, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously, I think, if there's an enormous amount of profit being made, then that person has less justification for um, not undertaking certain, morally necessary activity. I mean, two things here, and I think you're picking up on one thing. I mean, sometimes it just seems when there's so much poverty in the world for people to make enormous amounts of profit, it seems, I presume that's partly what you're talking about. It seems, I suppose, outrageous for people to just accumulate all sorts of enormous amounts of money and not take into account that, others, the lives and situations, circumstances of other people. I think in terms of the taxonomy I've got there, I mean, there'd be less justification. I mean, if you're making an enormous amount of profit, it's very hard to see that you've got justification for not engaging in morally worthy uh, uses of that money. And the idea that you would be a leucopath in that, well, okay, look, I mean, I don't want to get too political here in a way, but I mean, clearly some of what's going on, the sort of stuff that you're talking about with trillionaires and billionaires, is people that are really close to being leucopaths, that really are doing um, anything for money. And it's not as if they've got any justification for it in terms of the necessity of, survival or, business surviving, because they're making an enormous amount of money. So, as I said, I hadn't really thought it through and whether the money makes a difference, but I do think typically there's less and less justification, or if there's any justification, for not taking more substantive moral considerations into account when you're making enormous amounts of money. Does that answer your question, Andrea? So,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
so
if so,
yeah,
then probably how probably you're talking about the leucopathic side of uh the motivations of making immense amounts of money,
yep.
whereas it's not the amount itself that affects your view. So you're thinking that the point of it's being leucopath instead of the amount itself.
Yeah, look, I think it's when you're pursuing money. No, that's good, nice way of putting it. It's whether or not moral considerations other than your pursuit of your own money come into play in your all things considered judgments. I suppose it's about the role of money in the way that we make decisions. And the leucopathic idea is somebody who just really doesn't take into account um, anything other than selfish, and pursuit of money. But I mean, that's the point I was making about the difference between self-interest and selfishness. Human beings, we need to make a living, and the mere fact that you're looking after yourself in that sense, you're self-interested, doesn't necessarily, by that, it's not immoral. But um, I mean, the sort of things you're talking about where people are making an enormous amount of money, as a matter of fact, I think many of those people are leucopaths. I do think, and just to repeat the point I was making, I think that once you're making a certain amount, enormous profits, then I think it's incumbent on you to start to make, to begin to think about other ways that money could be used other than your own self-interest, I think. So,
Okay, thank
but
you.
anyway,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for your question and Adrian for your answer. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. Okay, maybe I have a question for you, Adrian. It's just a curiosity. It's about
Yep.
the compatibility thesis and the historical trajectory. I was wondering if you have an idea of what are the main authors or theories that were key in the acceptance of the compatibility thesis. If there are special
Yeah.
moments or special theories that incepted and then provide the large acceptance of the compatibility thesis.
I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but historically there's been, a shift away from the idea that certain kinds of profit are immoral. Now, the interesting case here is usury, or the making money from lending money at interest, and you find a gradual acceptance of this over time. Look, so if you say Aristotle condemned it, the medieval philosophers condemned it. And Aquinas, who actually, as a matter of fact, is quite positive about. I mean, he was the son of a merchant. He actually thinks that he doesn't think money seeking is immoral if you're trying to raise a family or whatever it is. You've got some useful purpose. So he's not like the Franciscans or some of the more ascetic philosophers and theologians. I mean, Aquinas, interestingly, is somebody who thinks that money, the business can be legitimate, pursuing a profit can be legitimate. It needs to be constrained, but nonetheless, he thinks it's legitimate. But interestingly, the usury and the making money out of lending money at interest was something he condemned. You find a gradual. I want to actually say something about the historical shift here because it's relevant to a book that Joachim and I just finished. But there's a gradual acceptance through the Reformation that money, that making a profit out of banking wasn't immoral. I mean, Calvin famously said that money was. I mean, it's okay. Aristotle said money was barren, right? And so that therefore, it couldn't be fertile. It couldn't money couldn't give rise to more money by itself. Right. So this is an argument from barrenness, and this is repeated. I mean, Aristotle said it. I think it was based on a joke in his part. Tokos means both child, and it also means a token as in money. And he said tokos can't give rise to tokos. Well, this Aristotelian belief in the barrenness of money was held by many philosophers and more theologians, all through the medieval period. It wasn't until, you say, someone like Calvin says money is only barren if it's buried and put in a box and put in the ground. Famously, Bentham wrote a series of articles called The Defense of Usury, and he attacked Smith, who actually wanted to put a limit on the percentage you could charge when lending money. So, and Bentham pilloried the sort of usury doctrine. And I think what happens is it just gradually became accepted that there was just a gradual acceptance over time of, that interest, lending at interest was necessary for the, productive, economy. Why just preface that? Because I mean, one of the things that the book that Joachim and I have just written, Between Ethics and Economics, which has this theory of moral leeway, is it's not that our central thesis is not that morality disappears. It's just that we find the moral considerations are still there, but often what happens is a certain kind of leeway that's given where activities between us as if we were friends, activities that would seem wrong, I mean, in a business context, are acceptable within certain limits. I mean, there's a certain leeway that's given where morality is still relevant, but it's no longer as strictly or rigidly adhered to as would be in between families and friends. So that's the idea of leeway. So it's interesting you raised that historical point. I think there is a gradual acceptance of legitimacy and the compatibility of profit seeking and morality. But I think also if you look at the way some of it's encoded into our laws try to maintain, prevent people engaging in immoral things. But there's also, I think those moral considerations still exist. It's just the understanding of the rigor with which certain kinds of moral values should be adhered to when we're interacting in a business context, is that there's the leeway, they're less rigorously applied. Sorry, that's a rather long-winded answer, but kind of your question picked up on something that Joachim and I have recently worked on in terms of the way that you get this shift and acceptance and of the idea that profit-seeking and morality can be compatible, and the way historically we've become more lenient, I suppose is the right way of putting it, about certain kinds of practices that wouldn't be appropriate between friends and family. We've become more lenient about those, but it doesn't mean that morality has disappeared. I think that's a point that we're trying to make.
Thank you very much for this very interesting answer. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. I don't see questions, so hence maybe Declan, you have Lisa. Okay, Lisa, of course, you're.
You couldn't find my virtual hand. Yeah, I'm wondering how you think about your analysis of morality with respect to corporate actions, and how the constraints ought to work. So if you have, say, a drug company making extreme profits, it's perhaps it's harmful to consumers at large, but there are no legal constraints and they're charging what the market can bear. And I'm wondering, at what point do corporations, say, cross over to being lucre paths, and how should we think about the kinds of constraints? Because as you were just saying, we don't have there's more leeway in business, and yet, that's where some of the more egregious profit seeking occurs. So how would we think about constraints on businesses, for example?
Look, I think that should be the same as the constraints we'd expect on individuals. I mean, I think there should be. I mean, we need legal constraints, but we also, I mean, they themselves, there's certain being leucopaths. I mean, think about some of those appalling things that have happened where, maybe in a developing world, a large-scale multinational has gone and poisoned. Think of, without naming, and we can think of lots of these cases where there's been an area poison, nobody's cared, they've known it was happening. Well, clearly that's both immoral and probably should be illegal too. But I mean, I think those moral considerations should apply to corporations as much as they do to individuals. I mean, actually, in the book with Joachim, there's a whole 2 chapters on corporations and why morality still matters, despite the leeway that we give to corporations. But morality is still important. I mean, in that sense, the morality here needs to be, I mean, part of it, obviously, you want state legislation, state regulation to prevent some of it, but also it's incumbent on corporations when they're making enormous profits to actually take into the account those sorts of moral considerations. Because I think you're right. I mean, when we talk about the profit motive, some of what makes it sound is like I'm a little small shop owner and I'm just, I'm doing that. But in fact, obviously, the profit motive, we're talking about large scale corporations.
Well, I think that the constraints would be there. You don't want to be harming people, but you find cases where the corporation can make what we might consider to be obscene profits. Just maybe comes back to the example you gave earlier about selling beer at the airport. Just
well, yeah, that's right. I mean,
it's not directly harm. It's charging what the market will bear, and it's maybe a kind of price gouging. And does that cross over to being lucropathic, or is this just?
I think it's a blur. I mean, the lucropathic where I have in mind is really where there's no moral considerations being taken into account. I presume you could still be running a morally justifiable business, but making enormous profits. Then I think there's other considerations that come into play. The taxonomy there doesn't really capture that straightforwardly, and it's a good point. I think when you're making enormous amounts of money, then there's other considerations that come into play, which are, maybe you've got an obligation to the society as a whole. And there is a whole enormous discussion about that in business ethics, of course. I mean, it's a slightly different case, but let's just say they are acting morally, and they are, maybe it's a highly virtue, they're engaged in some activity that, I don't know, it's helping reduce climate change or something, whatever it is, but they're making obscene profits. And there's different kinds of considerations. But I think, I mean, in those kinds of cases, they should start to think about where else the money could go, what else they could do, I think.
Okay.
And thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Adrian. I don't know if there are other questions in the audience. I don't see questions, and I don't know if Declan has a last point. Okay.
No, thank you.
Okay. So I think we can stop here and thank again Adrian and Declan for the very interesting interview and interaction. It was very stimulating, and of course, I hope to see you soon again on the financial line seminars, and the doors are always open for you. And I think.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about the chapter. So it's great. Thank you. And thanks, Declan, for the questions.